On the 22nd of December, 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky was led out before a firing squad at Semyonov Place in St. Petersburg after being found guilty of involvement in a banned literary group. Before the sentence was carried out, it was commuted to exile in Siberia for several years. Later, Dostoevsky went on to write some of the most acclaimed books of the modern era, notably Crime and Punishment, a novel in which existential dread clung to his characters as they navigated a story of psychological torment, paranoia, and guilt. It raises the question whether he ever recovered fully from his treatment and near-death experience. This is the story of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Russia's great existential novelist. The man known to history as Fyodor Dostoevsky was born on the 11th of November, 1821, in Moscow, Russia's former and future capital. Though at the time, in the 19th century, the city of St. Petersburg served as the Russian capital. According to the old-style Julian calendar that was still in use in Russia in the 19th century, his date of birth was the 30th of October. His father was Mikhail Dostoevsky, a medical doctor and civil servant who was admitted to the ranks of the Russian hereditary nobility in 1828 in recognition of his extensive government service. The Dostoevsky family ultimately traced its ancestry to Danilo Irtish, a Lithuanian nobleman who all the way back in 1506 had been given the village of Dostoyevo in present-day Belarus. Surnames in late medieval times were often fashioned as indicators of where a family came from, and so the Dostoevsky family acquired this surname. Subsequent generations of Dostoevskys moved to Russia and Poland. Fyodor's branch of the family ended up in Ukraine, where his great-grandfather and grandfather served as priests in the Uniate Church, churches that formed part of the Greek Orthodox Church, but which had close ties to the Roman Catholic Church. These celebrated Orthodox rites while also acknowledging the supreme authority of the Pope in Rome. Mikhail studied at a seminary, but ran away to Moscow to pursue his medical studies at the age of 15. Then, in 1819, the 30-year-old Mikhail Dostoevsky married Maria Nicheva, the attractive 19-year-old daughter of a Moscow merchant. Maria's cheerful and sympathetic character contrasted with her husband's more serious demeanor, but the couple had a happy and loving marriage. Their first son, named Mikhail after his father, was born in November 1820. Fyodor followed almost exactly a year later. The couple would have 5 more surviving children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born just a few years after peace had finally been restored to Europe, following more than 2 decades of warfare during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that began in April 1792 and continued with few interruptions until the summer of 1815. Tsar Alexander I of Russia had succeeded to the throne in 1801, seeking to implement constitutional reforms inspired by the ideas of his Swiss tutor Frédéric César de la Harpe. Progress in this regard was completely halted by the necessity of dealing with the Napoleonic Wars. Russian armies were defeated by Napoleon at Austerlitz in 1805 and Friedland in 1807, compelling Alexander to make peace with the Napoleonic Empire at Tilsit. This ushered in another attempt at political reform under Alexander's chief minister, Mikhail Speransky, but increasing tensions with the French from 1810 onwards led to Speransky's dismissal and the end of his reforms. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was a traumatic experience for Tsar Alexander, even though the Russians would expel the invader and join with Prussia and Austria to defeat Napoleon in Germany and France in 1813 and 1814, forcing Napoleon's abdication. Russian armies were in France again in 1815, after Napoleon was restored to the throne. While Napoleon was defeated for the final time at the Battle of Waterloo, before the Russians had any fighting to do, a Russian contingent remained in France as part of the Allied Army of Occupation until 1818. There, they came into contact with new ideas about more open and democratic societies, and in particular, ones where a better socio-economic system prevailed. France and other Western European nations were already heading towards full capitalist systems by the early 19th century, whereas Russia remained a profoundly feudal and medieval society where serfdom was still even in place. The Russian officers and soldiers who had breathed the air of freedom in Paris returned to St. Petersburg and were disappointed in the years that followed when Tsar Alexander failed to live up to his earlier reforming tendencies. They anticipated some improvements in the conditions of the peasant class who served in the rank and file of the Russian army, but instead the government was dominated by the much disliked General Alexei Arakcheyev. Some of the more radical officers joined secret societies seeking to overthrow the Tsar, or at least force a constitution upon him, which would involve the regular holding of Dumas, the Russian name for a parliament. Their plans were interrupted by Alexander's unexpected death in December 1825. Grand Duke Constantine, next in line to the throne, had previously declined the succession and swore an oath to his younger brother, Grand Duke Nicholas, who, after some hesitation, became Tsar Nicholas I. The radical officers exploited the confusion to stage a demonstration at Senate Square in St. Petersburg with some 3,000 men. Amid calls of, quote, Constantine and Constitution, the forces loyal to Nicholas initially sought a peaceful solution, but when this failed, the uprising was brutally crushed by artillery and cavalry. The 5 ringleaders of the rebellion were executed, and more than 100 participants were exiled into Siberia, the vast, cold, and thinly inhabited region of Russia, east of the Ural Mountains. Although Tsar Nicholas I had asserted his authority, the ideas of the Decembrists continued to circulate among the intellectuals of St. Petersburg. All of this foreshadowed the political and social crises that would mark Russia's history, as well throughout Dostoevsky's life and beyond. The Decembrist uprising shaped the course of Russian politics and society over the following decades while young Fyodor was growing up. Debates about political reform, the condition of the peasantry, huge numbers of whom were still serfs tied to the land and their feudal overlords in a kind of medieval quasi-slavery, as well as the nature of the Tsarist government, the power and role of the Russian Orthodox Church, and what it meant to be a Russian, played a key role in Dostoevsky's work. Although he would spend much of his life in St. Petersburg and other places, he grew up in Moscow. His father worked at the hospital for the poor in the suburbs, and the young Fyodor and his siblings often played in the garden with the poor children. Although Dr. Dostoevsky had abandoned his priestly career, he remained a devout Orthodox Christian, and Fyodor was introduced to the Bible at around the age of 4, as soon as he began to learn to read and write. However, the elder Dostoevsky also placed a heavy emphasis on secular education, and the young Fyodor grew up listening to his father reading from works like Nikolai Karamzin's History of the Russian State, as well as works by Russian poets Gavrila Dreshvin, Vasily Zhukovsky, and above all, Alexander Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet of the age. Nor was Fyodor's introduction to literature and history exclusively Russian. He loved the ancient author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer, as well as modern Spanish and British writers like Miguel de Cervantes and Sir Walter Scott, and was also familiar with the likes of William Shakespeare, Friedrich Schiller, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Until the age of 10, Fyodor rarely ventured outside Moscow, except for pilgrimages to the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery, north of Moscow, and one of the most important sites in the Russian Orthodox Church. This changed in 1831. That year, Mikhail Dostoevsky bought the small estate of Darovoy in his wife's name. Although the doctor continued to work hard and struggled to find time to go to the country, Maria and the children would spend 4 months every year at the estate and much less time in Moscow. Maria was a capable administrator who managed the estate effectively and was sympathetic to the concerns and strife of the serfs on the land. Unlike on many other Russian aristocratic estates, the Dostoevsky children were not prevented from interacting with the serfs and sometimes offered to help out. Such experiences gave Dostoevsky first-hand insight into the condition of the Russian peasantry, which would inform his literary creations, particularly the Brothers Karamazov, arguably his greatest work. Dostoevsky later recalled that the fondest moments of his childhood were spent at Darovoi, though his stays gradually became shorter after he and his brother Mikhail were sent to Chermak's boarding school in 1834. The Dostoevsky brothers continued to be exposed to the leading writers of the day. Russian journals carried translations of French writers like Honoré de Balzac, Victor Hugo, and Georges Sand, but the brothers were particularly influenced by Nikolai Gogol and Alexander Pushkin. Both brothers dreamed of literary careers. Fyodor yearned to write a novel about Venice, while Mikhail was constantly writing poetry. As they reached their mid-teens, the brothers' literary dreams would be shattered. By the middle of the 1830s, as Fyodor was entering his mid-teens, their mother's health was in steady decline, and their overworked father was also not in the best of health. In an effort to ensure that his sons could make do should both he and his wife die young, Dr. Dostoevsky signed them up to the School of Military Engineering in St. Petersburg. The boys were appalled by this decision, but their mother Maria's death in February 1837 removed the final impediment to their departure and convinced them of the wisdom of their father's actions. At around the same time, the brothers also heard the news that Pushkin had been killed in a duel with his brother-in-law. Dostoevsky later remarked that had he not already been in mourning for his mother, he would have been in mourning for Pushkin as one of his great literary heroes. The confluence of traumatic events may have caused a throat ailment that troubled Fyodor, postponing the journey for several weeks. In early May, Dr. Dostoevsky and his two eldest sons finally left for the capital. Although they were disappointed by the prospect of becoming military engineers, Fyodor and Mikhail nevertheless were enthusiastic about being in the cosmopolitan city of St. Petersburg. The brothers planned to make a pilgrimage to the location of Pushkin's fatal duel, and then to visit Pushkin's apartment on the banks of the river Moika, a small river where St. Petersburg stands, and where the great poet had died. With such romantic notions in their heads, on their way to the capital, the boys witnessed a government courier climbing onto a mail coach and beating the driver with his fists for no apparent reason. The episode stayed with Fyodor for the rest of his life as a manifestation of the brutality that accompanied the extreme social inequalities of Russia's society in the 19th century. By the time the Dostoevskys arrived in the capital, they received another nasty shock. Mikhail was excluded on the grounds of poor health and transferred to a less prestigious school in Reval, present-day Tallinn in Estonia, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. Fyodor passed his entrance exams, though the admissions official demanded a large bribe, a common occurrence in a highly corrupt society. The 16-year-old Fyodor began his studies at the engineering school in January 1838. The institution was based in Mikhailovsky Castle, built at the confluence of the Moika and Fontanka rivers by Tsar Paul I. After Paul was assassinated by disgruntled officers in March 1801, shortly after moving into the castle, it remained empty until the 1820s, when Alexander gave it to the school. Life as an engineering cadet was everything the teenager had feared. He struggled to adapt to military discipline, and he spent most of his time privately reading works of fiction, taking a particular interest in the fantastical tales of E.T.A. Hoffmann. He had few friends at school, apart from Ivan Berezhetsky, with whom he had lively literary discussions, though the friendship later turned sour. Outside the school, he befriended a civil servant named Ivan Shidlovsky, a published poet, who supported Dostoevsky's literary aspirations. In spring 1838, Fyodor failed his exams in military drill and was denied progression into the next class. The news was a heavy blow to his father Mikhail, who had retired to Darovoi after his wife's death and had started to drink heavily. Fyodor regularly demanded money from his father, which was reluctantly granted. In June 1839, shortly after Fyodor received a letter from his father complaining of his struggles meeting the financial demands of his education, he learned of his death. While the official cause of death was a stroke, rumors abounded that the doctor had been murdered by his serfs. Fyodor strongly believed that his father had been murdered for the remainder of his life. Although Dr. Mikhail Dostoevsky's death was certainly a tragedy for Fyodor. It gave him the freedom to pursue his literary interests to a greater extent than before. He did continue to study at the engineering school, being promoted to second lieutenant in 1841, and being given the right to live outside the school. He used this opportunity to attend performances of plays and ballets at the Alexandrinsky Theatre, and in 1842 he attended concerts given by Franz Liszt, the virtuoso Hungarian pianist, who was one of the greatest composers in the decades after Beethoven and Mozart. Such entertainments did not come cheap, and while Dostoevsky's salary as an officer was supplemented by the regular flow of funds from Daravoy, now managed by a competent brother-in-law, he was still frequently in debt. After graduating in August 1843 with the rank of lieutenant, he was discharged from the army in October 1844, determined to achieve literary stardom. He initially sought to write for the stage, but soon abandoned his dramas Boris Godunov and Mary Stuart. He and Mikhail then attempted to make money by translating foreign literature into Russian, and in 1843 he managed to sell his translation of Balzac's Eugénie Grandet. Balzac's realistic portrayal of his characters inspired Dostoevsky's breakthrough novel Poor Folk, which was completed in May 1845. The novel is structured as a correspondence between the two protagonists, the minor bureaucrat Makar Devushkin and the young lady Varvara Dobroselova. Their emotional bond sustains both of them as they go through the grind of daily life, but it is abruptly cut off when Varvara agrees to marry the wealthy Bykov. Following the marriage, Varvara adopts the wealthy lifestyle which she previously criticized and loses interest in art and literature, and Devushkin is left alone once again. Even before its publication in January 1846, Poor Folk caused a sensation. The writer Nikolai Nekrasov and the critic Vissarion Belinsky praised its author greatly for the realistic portrayal of ordinary Russians. While the character of Devushkin is based on the lowly bureaucrats who frequently appear in Gogol's stories, Gogol's protagonists are the target of ridicule, while Dostoevsky encourages sympathy for Devushkin. Dostoevsky became an honored member of Belinsky's literary circle thereafter. Despite his initial social anxiety, the praise heaped upon him encouraged his vanity, and he soon faced ridicule from his fellow writers. The young writer Ivan Turgenev regularly mocked Dostoevsky, and following a particularly humiliating episode in November 1846, Dostoevsky stopped attending the gatherings. Dostoevsky also faced increasingly critical reviews from Belinsky, particularly after the publication of his second novel, The Double, in which, rather than retreating from Gogolian fantasy, he doubles down on it by highlighting the split personality of his protagonist, Golyadkin, through a doppelganger who is more socially successful but behaves in a manner that Golyadkin finds inappropriate. Belinsky also had cause to criticize Dostoevsky's complex narrative style and his tendency to repeat the same episode from different perspectives. Their final break in early 1847 was caused by ideological differences. While both men had been influenced by the Christian utopian socialism espoused by early 19th century French writers such as Charles Fourier, Belinsky shifted further and adopted atheistic views which Dostoevsky could not stomach. Even so, Dostoevsky was shocked to hear of Belinsky's death from what is believed to have been tuberculosis in 1848 at just 36 years of age. Dostoevsky's feud with Belinsky had coincided with developments in wider Russian literary journalism and writing. In 1846, Nikolai Nekrasov had bought the rights to the periodical The Contemporary, founded by Pushkin a decade earlier, and engaged Belinsky as chief critic. Dostoevsky still had obligations to Notes of the Fatherland, hitherto Russia's leading literary journal, and continued to contribute a number of short stories. Among these was White Nights, in which the nameless narrator identifies himself as a young, romantic dreamer. He encounters a young woman, Nastya, who embodies his romantic dreams and values his companionship at a time when she is awaiting the return of an absent fiancé. Although the narrator's dreams are crushed by the appearance of the other man, he refuses to be disheartened and is thankful for the brief moment of happiness he had experienced. Despite the sympathetic portrayal, White Nights was intended as a parody of the romantic novels of the day and enjoyed a broadly favorable critical reception. In the meantime, he began working on the novel Natochka Nezvanova and joined an alternative literary circle convened by his former classmate, Alexei Beketov. This group only lasted for a few months, but it was through the Beketovs that Dostoevsky became acquainted with Mikhail Butashevich Petrashevsky, a socialist aristocrat who hosted a small group of progressive intellectuals. During the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, the Petrashevsky circle attracted larger numbers of left-wing radicals. One of these men was Nikolai Spezhnev, described as Russia's first communist, who invited Dostoevsky into a small, secret political society. The members also belonged to the larger Palm Durov circle, which planned to spread revolutionary propaganda throughout the capital. Although Dostoevsky was anxious that the Petrashevsky circle had been infiltrated by Tsarist agents, in April 1849 he read from Belinsky's letter to Gogol from 1847, an eloquent attack on the injustice of Russian serfdom in response to Gogol's defense of the Tsarist autocracy and the Orthodox Church. Dostoevsky's concerns had not been misplaced, as an informer named Antonelli had infiltrated the circle in January 1849. During the early hours of the 23rd of April, 60 members of the group were arrested and taken to the notorious Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg. During the interrogations, Dostoevsky admitted to harboring revolutionary ideas, but refused to implicate his fellow prisoners. While Tsarist authorities failed to uncover the Spezhnev circle, in September 1849, a military civil court sentenced 15 men to death, including Dostoevsky. After reviewing the case, Tsar Nicholas commuted the death sentences to hard labor in Siberia, but choreographed events to exhibit his full powers as arbiter of life and death. Thus, on the morning of the 22nd of December, Dostoevsky and his fellow prisoners were taken to Semenovsky Square. They had no idea what to expect, but feared the worst when they saw a scaffold and 3 stakes rising from the ground next to it. The prisoners were led to the scaffold as the sentences were read out by an officer. Every single person gathered heard that they were condemned to die by firing squad. Dostoevsky's heart sank in disbelief. When a priest mounted the scaffold holding a cross, even the most disbelieving atheists stepped forward to kiss it. Petrashevsky and 2 others were manhandled and tied to the 3 stakes in front of the scaffold. The firing squad aimed their rifles at the 3 condemned men. Dostoevsky had been in the second row and knew that he was next in line. Every second seemed like an eternity as he awaited the fatal volley of gunfire. The drums began to beat, but rather than the death knell, Dostoevsky saw the soldiers lower their rifles. The Tsar's aide galloped onto the scene with the pardon. Instead of death, Dostoevsky was given 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, after which he would be required to rejoin the army indefinitely, a process that would restore him his civil rights. Dostoevsky was obviously overjoyed by the reprieve, and despite 4 years in Siberia, he was still able to continue his writing there. At the same time, he wrote to Mikhail while he was in the cold East, expressing the fear that his fragile health might collapse because of the conditions. Dostoevsky began his journey to Siberia on the 24th of December and arrived in Omsk in late January 1850. The cramped living conditions in the barracks that Dostoevsky shared with his fellow inmates were both unbearable in the summer heat and yet also bitterly cold during the freezing winter months, when temperatures could induce frostbite indoors without heating. The appalling conditions and ill treatment from the sadistic Major Kritsov impacted on Fyodor's health and may have caused him to suffer his first epileptic fits, a condition that would plague him with growing frequency for the rest of his life. Even worse, Dostoevsky was not allowed to write and could only read from the New Testament. He shared his captivity with common criminals and murderers and was repulsed by them. The feeling was mutual, as the peasant convicts saw political prisoners as representatives of the upper class who continued to enjoy certain privileges and treatment from the authorities and were hardly capable of doing any manual work. Over time, Dostoevsky came to sympathize with the peasant convicts. and not only recognized their humanity, but came to see them as the basis for Russia's national salvation. Dostoevsky's interactions with peasant convicts in Siberia led to a spiritual rebirth and a reassessment of his previous ideas. His experiences here would shape his greatest works in the decades that followed, as he became aware of the nature of crimes which were met with punishment and how the mind was impacted by adversity. As a member of the Petrushevsky circle, Dostoevsky had seen himself as a member of the Russian intelligentsia and an evangelist for the cause of liberty among the Russian peasantry. His interactions with the peasant convicts convinced him that St. Petersburg intellectuals did not understand the people and had no right to preach to them. Having previously written them off as drunks and brutes, Dostoevsky now increasingly appreciated the hardships in their lives and the motivations behind their crimes. For many, the work was easier than life back on the farm, but they hated it because it was forced upon them. He saw talented craftsmen and artisans make trinkets and sell them for a few pennies, which they promptly used to buy alcohol through underhand means. For the peasants, the freedom of an alcoholic binge in violation of the prison code of behavior was worth more than a couple of pennies. After his 4-year sentence came to an end in February 1854, Dostoevsky was assigned to the 7th Line Battalion in Semipalatinsk, a remote outpost of the Russian Empire in present-day Kazakhstan. Although a mere private soldier, Dostoevsky's literary fame entitled him to better treatment amongst the former convict soldiers there, and he was soon allowed to live independently. He was allowed to read and write and enjoyed good relations with other officials in the city. He befriended Alexander Wrangel, a young lawyer who had admired Dostoevsky's work for several years and who arrived in Semipalatinsk in November 1854 to take up an appointment as a prosecutor. The two men soon began living together, and Wrangel did all in his power to improve Dostoevsky's conditions. When Tsar Nicholas I died in February 1855, Wrangel sought a pardon for Dostoevsky from the new Tsar Alexander II, which was not yet granted. The new Tsar was determined to act as a reformer of Russian society, but events would act against him and Russia before long, though he would achieve many things too. Dostoevsky was also employed as a tutor to the children of government officials while in Central Asia. In early 1855, for instance, he was a frequent visitor to the house of Alexander and Maria Isaev as a tutor to their young son, Pasha. Maria sympathized with the writer's unhappy plight of being banished to the furthest reaches of empire, and in response, Dostoevsky fell passionately in love with her. He saw himself as Maria's savior from her drunken husband, but was crushed when Alexander received a posting to the town of Kuznetsk and Maria agreed to follow him. The pair continued their correspondence. He sensed an opportunity when Alexander Isaev finally succumbed to his drinking habit in mid-1855. However, Dostoevsky's quest to gain the hand of the widow was far from straightforward. Firstly, Maria had become attached to a young schoolmaster, and secondly, as a private soldier with limited prospects, Dostoevsky was not an attractive suitor. In March 1856, he made a bold appeal to General Eduard Totleben, a former acquaintance from the engineering school, who had gained widespread fame for the military fortifications he designed to defend the city of Sevastopol from siege during the Crimean War of the mid-1850s. Totleben agreed to intercede on Dostoevsky's behalf, and in the autumn, the Tsar agreed that Dostoevsky could be promoted to second lieutenant or transferred to the civil service. After receiving his promotion in October 1856, Dostoevsky went to Kuznetsk and finally gained Maria's consent to the marriage. The couple were married in February 1857, but on their way to Semipalatinsk, Dostoevsky suffered from another epileptic attack which frightened his helpless bride. Acting on advice from a military doctor, Dostoevsky sought discharge from the army on grounds of ill health in January 1858, but this was not granted until March 1859. Dostoevsky was informed that he could not live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, so settled for Tver, on the road between the two great cities. In July 1859, Dostoevsky and Maria left Semipalatinsk and arrived in Tver 6 weeks later. During the intervening period, the couple began having doubts about their marriage. The writer was focused on resurrecting his literary career, while his wife regretted her rash decision to marry a middle-aged epileptic of uncertain prospects. Dostoevsky found life in Tver dull by comparison with the literary scene of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and directly petitioned the Tsar to be allowed to live in St. Petersburg. The appeal was granted, and Dostoevsky returned to the capital in December 1859. He had been away for a decade, and had undergone an ideological transformation from Westernizer to Slavophile. Much had changed on the Russian intellectual stage, and Alexander Herzen assumed Belinsky's role as the main driver of intellectual trends in his periodical, The Bell, published from exile in London. Meanwhile, the young radical Nikolai Chernyshevsky had become the editor of The Contemporary. In 1858, Mikhail Dostoevsky founded a monthly periodical known as Time, but it was only after Fyodor's arrival that the journal became successful. In addition to several anonymous articles, Fyodor contributed his novel The House of the Dead, inspired by his experiences in Siberian captivity. During this period, he contributed to the debate in Russian intellectual circles about the purpose of art and culture in a modernizing nation. He rejected Chernyshevsky's notion that art could only be useful if it depicted real life and served political causes. While Dostoevsky certainly was not opposed to drawing attention to the plight of the Russian peasant class in his books, he believed that art should be judged for its artistic merit alone, rather than its effectiveness in serving any political agenda, and that the beauty of art served the cause of humanity as a good in and of itself. Dostoevsky's efforts brought in over 4,000 subscribers for his brother's journal, but the 1860s proved a volatile period. In February 1861, the liberal Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom, a decision that was praised widely by radicals and political progressives. Dostoevsky, who had been involved in the kind of revolutionary circles who advocated for an end to serfdom many years earlier, was delighted that the Tsar had abolished an institution that had ceased to exist in many other parts of Europe hundreds of years earlier. While Dostoevsky retained his faith in Tsar Alexander for the rest of his life, the terms of the emancipation placed a heavy debt burden on the shoulders of the peasantry. This inspired a wave of student demonstrations in 1862, which resulted in Chernyshevsky's banishment to Siberia. Dostoevsky now took the opportunity to travel to Europe between June and September. Although he continued to respect European literature, the nationalist instincts Dostoevsky acquired during his years in Siberia led him to believe that Europe was morally bankrupt. His account of his travels, published in Time as Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, demonstrated that his opinions remained unchanged. In Paris, Dostoevsky sarcastically remarked that only the wealthy could afford liberty, and that Parisians were too self-obsessed to give any consideration for equality or fraternity. In London, he remarked on the extreme wealth inequality he saw in the capital of the world's wealthiest nation, the polluted air and water, and was particularly appalled to witness women selling the sexual services of their young daughters on the streets. After visiting the International Exhibition in South Kensington, Dostoevsky found the exhibition halls grotesque creations of the devil. While in London, he took the opportunity to call on Alexander Herzen and the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, the latter of whom was one of the foremost radical Russian political thinkers of the 19th century. Within months of his return to Russia, a Polish uprising against Russian rule in January 1863 brought further pressures on the journal. Although Dostoevsky had taken a patriotic pro-government line, a misinterpretation of an editorial caused the state to shut down the journal in May. The suppression of the journal coincided with a personal crisis in Dostoevsky's life. His marriage had broken down, and by 1861 he had officially separated from his consumptive wife, who moved to the provincial city of Vladimir. Later that year, Dostoevsky made his first acquaintance with Polina Suslova, a young female student with radical politics, who saw Dostoevsky as a champion of liberty against oppression. The pair began a physical affair sometime in 1862, but Polina resented Dostoevsky's opposition to female emancipation, and Dostoevsky was irritated by her demands that he divorce his wife. The two continued to see each other and planned to travel to Europe together. But while Dostoevsky was seeking to resurrect his journal, Polina decided to leave without him for Paris in June. He left St. Petersburg in August, and en route to Paris, he was distracted by the casino at Wiesbaden and proceeded to lose heavily, playing at the roulette wheels. By the time he arrived in the French capital, Polina had fallen for a young Spaniard, who soon cast her aside. He persuaded her to join him in Italy, promising that their interactions would remain platonic. As Dostoevsky struggled to keep his part of the bargain, Polina teased him mercilessly by flirting with other men, leaving Dostoevsky feeling jealous and betrayed. After a month and a half, the pair separated in Turin, with Polina returning to Paris and Dostoevsky heading on to the gambling paradise at Bad Homburg, then a mecca for European gamblers. He was only able to return to Russia after appealing to Polina for financial assistance. Dostoevsky had been recalled to Russia following news that his wife was dying. He arrived in Vladimir in October 1863 and was overwhelmed with pity, facilitating the couple's reconciliation. As his wife lay dying, Dostoevsky wrote Notes from the Underground, a dark tale in which the narrator rejects any notion of the common good and instead indulges in irrational, self-destructive decisions. In the course of what is one of his shortest books, Dostoevsky rejects the utopian vision in Chernyshevsky's influential 1863 novel, What is to be Done, that man can be guided towards the common good. The novella was serialized in Epoch, Mikhail Dostoevsky's new journal, and completed at around the time of Maria's death on the 15th of April, 1864. She was soon followed to the grave by Mikhail in July, who left behind a large family and substantial debts, which Fyodor agreed to take on. Dostoevsky also inherited editorial duties at Epoch, but financial pressures forced the publication to shut down in March 1865. Although heavily in debt, Dostoevsky decided that he needed to go on another European trip. He raised the funds by selling a new 3-volume edition of his work to the publisher Fyodor Dostoevsky for the pitiful sum of 3,000 rubles, together with an obligation to deliver a manuscript to him by the 1st of November, 1866. Failure to do so would give Dostoevsky the right to publish his works for free for up to 9 years, a penalty which would cost Fyodor heavily if imposed. With this time bomb ticking away, Dostoevsky headed straight for the casino in Wiesbaden. With his hotel manager denying him candles and meals in lieu of unpaid debts, Dostoevsky now began work on one of the greatest works of literature in world history. The first installments of what Fyodor came to entitle as Crime and Punishment were published in The Russian Messenger in early 1866. The protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov, is a young man living in abject poverty after being expelled from university. He is further troubled by the plight of his widowed mother and his young sister, who has been subject to harassment by a landowner. Inspired by great men of action, such as Napoleon Bonaparte, Raskolnikov plans to solve all his problems at once by murdering an elderly pawnbroker with a reputation for lending money at punitive rates and stealing her money. This hateful old woman hides away her wealth and does not even do anything useful with it. If only Raskolnikov could get his hands on the money, then at a stroke he could improve his own condition and have money left over to support his mother and sister. He believes this is justifiable, as he is capable of becoming a great man like Napoleon if only society affords him the financial means to achieve his goals. Armed with an axe, Raskolnikov successfully kills the old woman and then kills her sister, who stumbles upon the scene. Keen to make a quick getaway after the double murder, Raskolnikov takes only a handful of items and leaves most of the pawnbroker's wealth behind. The remainder of the novel deals with Raskolnikov's psychology as he grapples with his inner sense of guilt over his crimes, while trying to claim his innocence to authorities. Eventually, his conscience forces him to confess to the crime, and he is sent to Siberia, where he achieves full redemption through renewed faith in God under the influence of the compassionate Sonia Marmeladova, who accompanies him into exile. The novel was an instant success and enthralled the reading public, but some radical critics attacked Dostoevsky for libeling Russian students in his depiction of Raskolnikov. However, the critic Nikolai Strakov argued that rather than presenting Raskolnikov as an excessively sympathetic figure, Dostoevsky presented a deeply complex figure grappling with existential doubt after committing his crimes. Dostoevsky knew that Crime and Punishment was the best thing he had written, and so sold it to Mikhail Katkov at the Russian Messenger, rather than delivering it to Stolovsky to fulfill his obligations. He was still putting the finishing touches to the book by early October 1866, leaving him less than a month to submit a brand new manuscript to Stolovsky. Since his experiences at the gambling table in Wiesbaden and Bad Homburg, Dostoevsky had plans to write a tale about a gambler, but he could hardly complete it within a month. Dostoevsky accepted a friend's advice to hire a secretary, and on the 4th of October, the 20-year-old Anna Snitkina called on Dostoevsky at his apartment. Their collaboration began awkwardly, but soon the novel took shape in front of their eyes, and by the 30th of October, Anna presented Dostoevsky with the completed manuscript. During their collaboration, the pair found time to talk about their personal lives. When Dostoevsky asked Anna what he should do in his situation, the latter suggested that he should remarry and have children. When Anna visited Dostoevsky on the 8th of November to work on the epilogue of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky told her about his plans for a new novel, describing a middle-aged, impoverished writer and his young love interest, whom he called Anya. When Dostoevsky expressed some doubts that a young girl could ever consider marrying the writer, Anna countered that there was no impediment, so long as she had a good heart. When he asked Anna to place herself in the position of his heroine, the latter understood that they were no longer talking in hypotheticals and responded with an enthusiastic declaration of love. Anna soon began to help her fiancé take care of his financial affairs, and the pair married in St. Petersburg Trinity Cathedral on the 15th of February, 1867. Although Dostoevsky had received 7,000 rubles for the book edition of Crime and Punishment, this was not enough to pay off his creditors, and Anna was obliged to pawn off her dowry in order to raise funds for their honeymoon, which began in April. Dostoevsky continued to be irritated by Europeans, but he was delighted with his visit to the picture gallery in Dresden, where he was particularly taken by Raphael's Sistine Madonna. The couple argued often, as Dostoevsky was unwilling to allow Anna any professional independence, while Anna was jealous about his continued correspondence with Paulina. After a few weeks, Dostoevsky could not resist a trip to Bad Homburg, where despite Anna's warnings, he lost everything in 10 days at the gambling tables. Even this was not enough of a fix, and upon Dostoevsky's return to Dresden, the couple journeyed to Baden-Baden. Anna was forced to pawn her wedding ring and even her clothes to bail her husband out. But Dostoevsky seemed intent on losing everything, and succeeded in doing so. Dostoevsky called on his old rival, Turgenev, who had taken up permanent residence in Baden-Baden, but the two men were soon exchanging insults and tried to avoid each other. By September, the Dostoevskys were in Geneva, and any money that they received from friends and relatives was soon spent. It was only after Dostoevsky became even further indebted after a gambling session at Saxon-les-Bains in November that he was finally motivated to work on his new novel, which he entitled The Idiot. He had made early sketches in September, but did not make much progress until December, when he wrote 100 pages in just 23 days. Anna was by now several months pregnant, and in March 1868, the couple welcomed a daughter, whom Dostoevsky named Sonia, after the heroine in Crime and Punishment. Joy quickly turned to despair 3 months later, when the girl caught pneumonia and died. The protagonist of The Idiot, Prince Mishkin, is the son of a poor nobleman and a merchant's daughter, who suffers from epilepsy and is sustained by a strong faith in Christ. Mishkin is an idealized image of the author himself, in his quest to create a character who is absolutely good. To achieve this, Dostoevsky turns to the figure of the Yurodovy, or holy fool, a person who subjects themselves to humiliation by acting disruptively and challenging social norms while communicating essential truths, giving them special license to speak truth to power. Mishkin's humility and capacity to forgive owes much to the depiction of Christ in St. John's Gospel and its central message of love and forgiveness. The novel begins with Mishkin's return to St. Petersburg after 4 years in a Swiss sanatorium. The plot revolves around his inability to choose between two women, the intensely emotional society beauty Nastasia Filipovna and the beautiful and innocent Aglaia Ivanovna. Mishkin's compassion for Nastasia eventually compels him to agree to marry her on the grounds that she would die if he did not. The decision appalls Aglaia's family, and she is eventually married off to a Polish officer. On the day of Mishkin and Nastasia's wedding, the bride runs off with the wealthy Rogozin, who has been passionately pursuing her for the whole novel. By the time Mishkin arrives at Rogozin's house the following day, he discovers that the latter has murdered Nastasia. Rogozin is sentenced to 15 years in Siberia, while Mishkin is sent back to the Swiss sanatorium. Dostoevsky's notes show that he was writing the book without any clear idea how to end it. Critics saw the ending as unsatisfactory, since Mishkin's ideals of love and forgiveness did not prevent a tragic outcome. One of Dostoevsky's biographers, Geir Hirzar, suggests that the novel showed that while Mishkin may not have been able to change things on his own, a happier resolution may have been achieved had everyone aspired to his ideals. Following the death of their daughter, the Dostoevskys left Geneva and settled in nearby Vevey, where Dostoevsky labored to finish The Idiot. The mountains of Switzerland felt oppressive to him, and by September, the couple headed slightly south to Italy. After a couple of months in Milan, they went to Florence, where Dostoevsky was more impressed by its art and architecture than on a previous visit. He completed The Idiot in January 1869, and the final installment was published by The Russian Messenger in February. But the novel's poor reception meant that Dostoevsky could not count on improving his finances by selling the book edition. His spirits were lifted by the fact that Anna was pregnant again. But the heat of the Italian summer proved unbearable, and the couple made for Prague. They soon discovered that lodgings were too expensive and returned to Dresden, where their daughter Lyubov was born on the 26th of September. Dostoevsky was overjoyed, though the addition to the family increased financial pressures. While Dostoevsky began working on his next great novel, the couple remained in Dresden for a year and a half, but Prussia's victory in the Franco-Prussian War and the unification of the smaller German states to form the new German Empire under Prussian domination changed the situation. On a personal level, an imminent ban on casinos encouraged Dostoevsky to go on a final gambling trip to Wiesbaden in late April 1871. Dostoevsky was keen to return to Russia, and time was of the essence since Anna was once again pregnant. In late June, he received a large payment from the Russian messenger that allowed him to clear his debts and travel back home in July. 4 years in Western Europe did nothing to endear him to the continent, and he was glad to be back on Russian soil. The family's return to Russia had been financed by the fee for Dostoevsky's latest novel, Devils, also translated as Demons or The Possessed. It had been inspired by the brutal murder of a student at the Moscow Agricultural College named Ivanov by Sergei Nechayev on the 21st of November, 1869. They had been members of a left-wing student organization, and Ivanov appears to have been killed for his failure to support Nechayev's revolutionary nihilistic program. Dostoevsky saw the incident as a further demonstration of the impact of rationalist socialist doctrines that promised unlimited freedom, but actually resulted in despotism and violence. Dostoevsky considered it inevitable that Europe and Russia would fall to communism, an event which he associated with the apocalypse and the Last Judgment in the Book of Revelation. The members of the nihilistic revolutionary circle Dostoevsky portrays in the novel are therefore satanic agents and are explicitly associated with the beasts of Revelation. Pyotr Verkovensky, the son of the liberal intellectual Stepan Verkovensky, is the main theorist of the group and is likened to the serpent or dragon, a manifestation of Satan, while Nikolai Stavrogin, the central character, whom Verkovensky looks up to as the leader of his revolution, can be identified with the beast of the sea, the Antichrist, who usurps Christ's throne, setting up the final struggle between Christ and Satan. Verkovensky is frustrated by the fact that the disillusioned Stavrogin refuses to take on the leadership role, and at times the novel appears to be a parody of radicals who talked about organizing revolution, but never organized them in practice and were crippled by internal disputes. Verkovensky's solution to strengthen the cohesion of the group is to organize the murder of Shatov, a former revolutionary who has rejected their ideas. Meanwhile, the engineer, Alexei Kirillov, is determined to take his own life as the ultimate expression of free will, and is willing to sacrifice himself to the revolutionary cause. This is undermined by Kirillov's prolonged hesitation about actually carrying out the deed. It is only under pressure from Verkovensky that he finally does so. The 50-year-old Dostoevsky returned to St. Petersburg in July 1871, determined to remind the Russian people of their unique destiny. Within a few days, Anna gave birth to their first son, named Fyodor after his father. This coincided with the unwelcome arrival of bills and creditor notes. Anna took the initiative by securing the publication rights of her husband's works and negotiating more reasonable repayment schedules with his creditors. For all his financial woes, Dostoevsky was a famous writer by then, and in 1872, the art patron, Pavel Tretyakov, commissioned a portrait of him by Vasily Perov, now displayed in Moscow's Tretyakov Gallery. Dostoevsky also made his acquaintance with influential conservatives, including the journalist Prince Vladimir Mershevsky and the lawyer Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the tutor to Tsarevich Alexander, heir to the Russian throne. After the book edition of Devils was published in January 1873 by Anna, who established the Dostoevsky Publishing Company, Dostoevsky sent a copy to the future Tsar Alexander III, who was already a great admirer of his work, though Alexander subsequently became a deeply reactionary ruler, whose views could not have been further from Fyodor's. Anna had managed to sell out a print run of 3,000 copies of Devils, but Dostoevsky had to continue writing to keep the family afloat. In need of a break from long-form literature, Dostoevsky became editor of Prince Myshevsky's journal, The Citizen, in late 1872, where he began to publish his Diary of a Writer. His views did not always chime with the censors, and in light of these difficulties, he gave up the editorial role in spring 1874 and began working on a new novel that would become The Adolescent. He had also begun suffering from lung trouble, and in the summer he went to seek treatment at the German spa town of Ems. By July 1874, Dostoevsky was back in St. Petersburg and continued working on his novel. The previous summer, the family had spent the summer in the town of Staraya Russa, on the shore of Lake Ilmen, and Anna suggested doing so for the coming winter. Free from other distractions, Dostoevsky made swift progress. After making a second trip to Ems in the summer, Dostoevsky returned to Staraya Russa in time for the birth of his second son, Alexei, in August. When the family returned to St. Petersburg in September, The Adolescent was almost complete. In Devils, Dostoevsky identified the seeds of Fyodor Verkovensky's revolutionary nihilism in the naive liberalism of his father Stepan, and The Adolescent also explores the relationship between father and son. The protagonist, Arkady Dolgoruki, is the illegitimate son of the serf-woman Sonia and the aristocrat Vasilov. Sonia's husband, Makar, withdraws from the scene and becomes a holy man, while Vasilov quickly abandons the family. Growing up without a father, Arkady is on a mission to find a spiritual guide and seeks out his biological father, but the morally bankrupt Vasilov is in no position to play the role. Instead, Arkady finds his guide in Makar, now a venerable old man who embodies Dostoevsky's values to find love in Christ. After the completion of the novel, he restarted Diary of a Writer in 1876, then published by Nekrasov in Notes of the Fatherland, and was gratified to receive large piles of letters from readers seeking his advice or expressing admiration for his work, which spanned a range of subjects. When Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire of Turkey yet again in 1877, Dostoevsky enthusiastically supported the war effort and called for the annexation of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, as Russia won its most decisive ever victory against the Turks and succeeded in liberating Christian nations like Romania from Turkish rule in the course of the short conflict. Fyodor was particularly satisfied to see the names of his classmates among the heroes of the war, which ended in Russia's favour and now made it a major power in the Balkans and the leading Black Sea power. From the summer of 1876, Tsar Alexander II numbered among the subscribers to Dostoevsky's diary, and in 1878, Dostoevsky was invited to tutor the Tsar's younger sons, Sergei and Pavel. His fame was also increasingly well established beyond Russia's own borders by that time, and in the spring of 1878, he accepted an invitation to a conference on copyright in Paris, chaired by Victor Hugo, one of the greatest French novelists of the day, whom Fyodor continued to idolize. Fate intervened in a negative manner for Dostoevsky when his younger son Alexei suffered a series of epileptic attacks and died in May 1878. Dostoevsky sought consolation from the venerated Father Ambrosi at the Optina Pustin Monastery. After returning to St. Petersburg in the autumn, the family moved out of their city apartment into the same apartment where Dostoevsky lived when he began his literary career in the 1840s. In January 1879, the first installment of Dostoevsky's final and arguably greatest novel, which he entitled as The Brothers Karamazov, was published in installments in the Russian Messenger. Regarded as one of the masterpieces of world literature, Dostoevsky examined contemporary Russian attitudes towards morality through the lens of three brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha, the sons of Fyodor Karamazov from two marriages. Fyodor is also rumored to be the father of his servant, Pavel Smedyakov, whose mother died in childbirth. The action is driven by Fyodor and Dmitri's rivalry for the young and feisty Grushenka, who flirts with both of them, though eventually realizes that she is in love with Dmitri and regrets how she has hurt him. Dmitri intends to kill his lecherous father and becomes the prime suspect when Fyodor is found violently murdered at his house. Smedyakov, the only other person in the house, was suffering from an epileptic fit at the time. Dostoevsky's readers were on tenterhooks with each installment, speculating whether Dmitri had really murdered his father. Near the end of the novel, Smedyakov confesses to Ivan that he was responsible and had faked the epileptic fit. He justified the decision by appealing to Ivan's rationalist philosophy that everything is permitted, since God does not exist, and Fyodor was a tyrant who deserved to die. While Ivan descends into madness, Smedyakov takes his own life, and Dmitri is erroneously sentenced to 20 years in Siberia for his father's murder. To escape this fate, Dmitri and Grushenka make plans to escape to America. Although he plays a minor role in the main plot, Dostoevsky's hero is Alyosha, whose conversations with Dmitri and Ivan give the reader insight into their personalities. In particular, Ivan's defense of his atheism before the pious Alyosha in Book 5 of the work are among the most famous parts of the novel. Ivan argues that God would not allow so much suffering in the world, and if all the suffering were part of God's plan, then he would rather risk eternal damnation than submit to him. Ivan then outlines his argument by presenting a scenario set in 16th century Spain, in which Jesus returns to earth. He is brought before the Grand Inquisitor, who refuses to allow him to speak, and blames him for giving humanity the freedom to choose between good and evil, when most people would prefer to submit to authority, in return for having their material needs met. The Grand Inquisitor argues that since the crucifixion, the Church has laboured to provide the authority and moral certainty that people crave, and that as Christ's return undermines the Church, he would be burned at the stake. Alyosha initially seems to be convinced by Ivan's reasoning, but Dostoevsky counters Ivan's philosophy through Father Zosima, the revered holy man, who gives his last sermon before his death. While Zosima does not refute Ivan's arguments one by one, he emphasizes the love of all of God's creation, and that rather than passing judgment on sinners, man should regard the sin as his own and recognize that he is partly responsible as a member of a sinful society. For Dostoevsky, sin leads to suffering, which in turn brings redemption and happiness. The book is regarded as one of the finest examples of existential literature, where an author captures the internal struggles of his characters, both their good and bad qualities, and how these play out against a world in which absolute moral truths are elusive. While working on the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's health had worsened, and he was in terminal decline. On a fourth visit to Ems in August 1879, he was diagnosed with pulmonary emphysema, which the doctor said could be managed, but not cured. In February 1880, he was elected Vice President of the Slavic Benevolent Society, and in this capacity, he was invited to speak at the unveiling of a monument to Alexander Pushkin in Moscow. Pushkin had been dead for over 40 years, and both Westernizers and Slavophiles claimed his legacy. Dostoevsky's speech was not to be a mere eulogy to Pushkin, but a rallying cry to Russian intellectuals. The statue was unveiled on the 18th of June 1880, and Dostoevsky's speech on the 20th of June was intended to close the festivities. Dostoevsky characterized Pushkin as a prophet who embodied Russian values of universalism and love for all mankind, exhorting his audience to end their unseemly disputes and unite to promote this idea. The speech had the intended effect and received an enthusiastic response from all present, and even Turgenev had tears in his eyes as he helped Dostoevsky navigate his exit from the podium through the thronging crowds. This demonstration of unity proved short-lived, and soon Dostoevsky's speech came under attack from both liberals and conservatives in the press. Although he was able to complete the Brothers Karamazov, the press criticism and regular invitations to give public readings drained Dostoevsky's energy, and by the time the novel was completed, he had only 4 months to live. On the 6th of February, 1881, he suffered a hemorrhage when Tsarist authorities were carrying out a search next door. The following day, he suffered a second hemorrhage after an argument about the family inheritance. He received the sacrament from a priest and asked Anna to read the parable of the prodigal son in the presence of the children. He lived a couple of more days and appeared to be improving, but a third hemorrhage proved fatal, and he died on the evening of the 9th of February, 1881, at the age of just 59, the 28th of January in the old-style calendar. 3 days later, his body was taken to the Alexander Nevsky Lavra in St. Petersburg at a funeral which was attended by tens of thousands of mourners. The following day, he was buried close to Karamzin and Zhukovsky, 2 Russian writers who inspired his literary career. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky is credited with a unique insight into human psychology. After bursting onto the literary stage in the 1840s as a young leftist revolutionary, Dostoevsky's exile transformed him into a more conservative but complex Russian nationalist. His work was deeply shaped by his experiences. For instance, Crime and Punishment, which is considered by many to be his greatest novel, reflected his own experiences of imprisonment, exile, and punishment. Many of his other works also reflected his gambling problems, and indeed his reflections on his family and Russian society. These reached their peak in his masterwork, The Brothers Karamazov, a distillation of Dostoevsky's main ideas about life and society, and also a novel in which he questioned the very nature of 19th century Russia. The 19th century was arguably the high watermark of the novel as a form. Britain had Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters, France had Victor Hugo, Émile Zola and Alexandre Dumas, and Russia had Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy. Dostoevsky was one of Russia's greatest cultural figures, though one who lived a life filled with trouble and strife of his own making too. What do you think of Fyodor Dostoevsky? Was he one of the greatest novelists who ever lived, capable of uncovering essential and uncomfortable truths about the human condition? Or was he guilty of idealizing the Russian people, projecting his own experiences in his attempts to present a universal formula for human happiness? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.